April 14th, 1561. Before sunrise. The sky over Nuremberg begins to move. Witnesses would later describe spheres, crosses, long dark cylinders, clashing against each other for over an hour before several seemed to crash beyond the city walls in a burst of smoke. A local artist named Hans Glaser documented it in careful detail on a printed broadsheet. That document still exists, sitting in a library in Zurich today. He wasn't writing fiction. He was reporting the news. You'd think stories like this belong entirely to the modern age. Cell phone footage, blurry drone videos, government hearings with vague acronyms. But the real answer is far stranger. People have been looking up at the sky, seeing things they couldn't explain, and writing them down for well over 2,000 years. Long before phones, long before flight, long before anyone had a word for aircraft, let alone anything stranger. So did your ancestors see UFOs? Start with what that question actually means. Not spaceships, necessarily. Just this: unexplained objects moving through the sky, witnessed by real people, recorded in real documents that still exist today. Rome is a good place to begin. In the 1st century BC, the historian Livy compiled an enormous history of Rome, and buried inside it were dozens of strange entries called prodigies. Unusual events the Romans believed carried meaning from the gods. Centuries later, a writer known as Julius Obsequens pulled many of these prodigy reports into a single collection called the Liber Prodigiorum, the Book of Prodigies. Some of these entries describe familiar disasters, plagues, floods, strange animal births. But scattered among them are entries that read almost exactly like modern sighting reports. A blazing light crossing the sky from noon toward the north, bright enough to turn night into something resembling day. Objects described only as shapes or spears appearing above the horizon and then vanishing. These weren't isolated cranks writing in the margins. They were recorded as part of Rome's official civic memory, taken seriously enough to prompt public rituals meant to calm whatever anger the gods might be expressing. Now fast forward back to that broadsheet in Zurich, and what happened just 5 years after it. In 1566, a similar account emerged from the Swiss city of Basel. Witnesses described dark spherical objects, some described as red or black, moving against each other in the sky over multiple days. Here's where the story gets genuinely interesting, and where it stops being simply, ancient people saw strange lights. Historians and scientists studying these accounts today have proposed several very different, very grounded explanations, and it's worth sitting with all of them rather than reaching for just one. Some researchers point to atmospheric optical phenomena, particularly a well-documented effect called a sundog, or parhelion, where sunlight refracts through ice crystals high in the atmosphere and produces multiple bright glowing shapes clustered near the sun. Others point toward meteor activity, or comet fragments, events that could easily explain something crossing the sky and appearing to burn or fall. Still, others suggest something less astronomical entirely. Mass psychology, a crowd primed by religious anxiety and the visual language of the era, interpreting an ambiguous sky event through the only framework available to them: divine warning, spiritual battle, cosmic omen. The psychologist Carl Jung actually wrote about the Nuremberg event directly in a 1958 book examining what he called flying saucers, as, in his words, a modern myth of things seen in the skies. His interest wasn't in proving what people saw. It was in understanding why the human mind, across centuries, keeps reaching for remarkably similar imagery when confronted with something inexplicable overhead. And the ufologist Jacques Vallée, who has spent decades cataloging historical sighting reports, has raised a related and more skeptical point. He's noted that the strange similarity between events like Nuremberg and Basel, occurring only 5 years apart in neighboring regions, might suggest something simpler than either aliens or pure coincidence, a kind of recurring cultural template, a stock way of describing an unsettling sky event that got passed along and echoed in how later witnesses framed what they saw. None of these explanations require you to believe the objects were extraterrestrial. None of them require you to believe the witnesses were lying either. What they require is holding two things at once. Real people, in real cities, on real recorded dates, genuinely witnessed something in the sky they could not explain. And multiple grounded possibilities exist for what that something actually was, ranging from ordinary atmospheric science to the very human tendency to interpret ambiguous phenomena through the stories already living in our heads. This is where the pattern becomes worth noticing. It shows up far beyond Europe. Chinese astronomical records stretching back over 1,000 years describe glowing objects and unexplained lights crossing the sky, cataloged alongside genuine astronomical events like comets and novae, because ancient Chinese court astronomers took celestial observation extremely seriously as a matter of state importance. Wherever you look, in wildly different cultures, with no contact with one another, you find the same basic behavior. Someone looks up, something doesn't make sense, and it gets written down because whatever it was, it mattered enough to remember. Here's the modern mirror, and it's a close one. Today's UAP reports, unidentified anomalous phenomena, the term now preferred over UFO in official government usage, follow a strikingly similar shape to what you just read about Rome and Nuremberg. Multiple witnesses, genuine confusion, a range of explanations offered afterward, from mundane, weather balloons, drones, aircraft lighting, atmospheric optics, to the deeply uncertain. Governments today convene panels and commission investigations into these reports for largely the same underlying reason Roman priests once performed public rituals after a prodigy. Something was witnessed. It demands an explanation. And the explanation isn't always obvious, even now, with radar, satellites, and infrared cameras that Livy or Hans Glaser could never have imagined. So did your ancestors see UFOs? Depending entirely on how you define that word, the honest answer might be yes. They saw things in the sky they couldn't identify, exactly the way people still do today. Whether those things were meteors, atmospheric optics, comets, mass psychological phenomena, something else entirely, or something we genuinely don't have an answer for, is a question historians, scientists, and skeptics are still actively working through, using evidence rather than certainty. What's not really in dispute is the record itself. The prodigies Livy compiled, the broadsheet Hans Glaser printed, the Basel accounts 5 years later, the centuries of Chinese court astronomy. These are documents, not legends, sitting in real archives, describing what real people said they witnessed. Somewhere tonight, someone will look up and see a light they can't explain. They'll reach for their phone instead of a woodblock and a printing press. But the impulse underneath it, the need to look up, to notice, to record, to ask what that actually was, is exactly the same impulse that filled a broadsheet in Nuremberg in 1561 and a scroll in Rome centuries before that. Your ancestors didn't have satellites, radar, or infrared cameras. What they had was the same sky you're looking at tonight and the same unanswered question, staring back.